Hello, it is the 11th of July. I am Shane Greenup, and welcome to the first ever episode of Everything Misinfo. The podcast's so new that I don't have a name for it yet, and I'll deal with that soon. I'm here with Mike Hind as my first ever guest, and
Hello.
Thank you for joining me. And before we get into talking with you, I just want to go through some basic news that's happening at the moment and some announcements in the Misinfo space. So first of all, we need to go over here. And first, upcoming events. MisInfoCon is taking place on the 6th and 7th of August in Washington, D.C. After that, there is a Global Engagement Center's Tech Demonstration Series taking place at the UN headquarters in New York City on the 24th of July. Now, going a bit further afield, the Rita Allen Foundation is holding a Misinformation Solutions Forum on the 4th of October. And Stanford is holding a Digital Technology and Democratic Theory event on the 13th to the 15th of December. Now, all these events can be found in the Digital Disinformation Calendar of Events, which I will link to in the show notes for this podcast, wherever you find it. I should be able to provide that information there and links to all these events. For any academics doing research in the space on fairness, accountability, and transparency of algorithmic systems, the FAT 2019 conference, which is taking place early or late February 2019, put out a call for papers. So anyone doing research in that area might be interested in that. Again, I'll provide the links in the show notes. Also, recently, WhatsApp has put out a call for exploration and research in the areas of information processing of problematic content, election-related information, network effects, digital literacy, detection of problematic behavior within encrypted systems. So if you're doing research in this space and you can help WhatsApp identify misinformation, then they're looking to award some money. And finally, for the announcements, there's been some news recently that YouTube is going to start promoting and funding authoritative news. Now, I won't go into this too much. This is just headlines, and like I say, links will be below. So they're the announcements for the episode, just to sort of bring everyone up to speed on what's happening. And with all that done, we can get to talking to Mike about misinformation, disinformation. Would you like to introduce yourself, your background, and what you've been doing lately with the Disinformation Age podcast?
Yeah, well, I'm Mike Hind, currently quite distracted by my own image on one side of the screen while I'm trying to focus on you.
I've got that same problem right there.
Probably some really strange vibe going on for everybody who's looking at me. So I was a journalist many years ago, and I was interested particularly in investigative journalism. And I went into PR, but I never really lost the taste for a good story. So when Brexit happened, I became particularly interested in what I thought was an entire kind of shadow world of bad actors, but fake actors. And then, of course, the whole fake news. We don't really use that term anymore in the world of disinformation. Fake news is a bit old hat. But when that began to make news, I began to be interested in where that came from. And so around about a year ago, along with a guy called John Gray, who owns a social media analytics tool called MentionMap, we began discussing these issues between the two of us on my podcast, which is The Disinformation Age. And in that time, it's been a bit of a journey. So it began as a fairly kind of simple issue for me, which was, look, lots of people are getting their information online, and it's very easy to game the online space and put out lots of false content and use pretend people to distribute and amplify the false content. But I think it's become a lot more. It's become a lot more complex in my mind since that time, and I kind of feel like I've run into the sand uh, of late, because I'm starting to think that it's so multifaceted, and I'm not seeing anybody really being able to get a grip on any single aspect of it, and certainly not the kind of global problem, which is the way in which we process information and where we get our information from, and then what we do with that information, how we critique it. So, slightly long-winded introduction. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So you come from a background of journalism, and you got interested in this story of the shadowy aspect of. So in the disinformation age, you particularly focus on Twitter, and I suspect that that's, like so many people in this space, comes from a consequence of the fact that Twitter's somewhat open, and you can research them and find connections. It's so public, whereas something like Facebook, it's much harder to follow these connections.
Yeah, it's partly that, and it's partly not even as sophisticated as that. It's just that I spend a lot of time on Twitter, therefore I'm exposed a great deal to the content that I see on Twitter, and the kinds of personas which are promoting the content that we find on Twitter. I'm aware that false content and bad actors are everywhere online. And if I was going to name a platform that I thought was potentially the most egregious, I think I'd say it was YouTube. But I don't really spend that much time on YouTube, but I read a lot about YouTube.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's got the reputation for you never read the comments on YouTube. So you're specifically talking in the comments, or I guess in the videos as well?
I think in the videos, I'm certainly aware that. So the real problem, one of the problems, let's just dive straight into the weeds here.
Absolutely.
I think one of the real problems with disinformation, or I've stolen a phrase that I much prefer from a woman called Claire Wardle at First Draft News.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And Claire calls it information disorder. And I think that that's much more apposite, because that reflects one of my thoughts, which is that there is a widespread assumption that disinformation is a supply side issue, and that all we need to do is identify what content is fake, distinguish it from the true content, and then everybody will flock to consume the good content. That's the supply side idea, or the supply side solution idea. But over the last year or so, monitoring the way that all kinds of people seem to think and certainly behave, and I'm counting myself among them, I think one of the real problems is that it's a demand side issue as much as it's a supply side issue. And so, coming back to YouTube, I'm fascinated to see how, if I watch a certain piece of content, I am very, very rapidly funneled into an entire and endlessly deep rabbit hole of similar content. So that's a real problem. So another problem that I have realized over the time of doing the disinformation age is that there is also a structural issue at play here,
sure.
Which is kind of the entire business model of the internet. It's the attention economy.
For sure. And that's a problem. So actually, since in the announcements, I mentioned that YouTube have just announced that they're going to start promoting authoritative news. Do you think this is going to help deal with that, or is it just another band-aid that's not going to change? Because it seems like the objective that they're going after there is to identify authoritative news and then preferentially link to them for breaking news is what they keep talking about in it. So I'm wondering if it's like, great, for very specific circumstances, you can sort of rely on them to provide you with good information. But then once you're watching that, are the recommended videos in the side panel going to be the same things that take you into conspiratorial land? I wonder.
I'm really troubled by the likes of YouTube or Google or Facebook or any of the platforms whose business model is founded on attention and clicks, setting themselves up as the arbiters of which content we should consume in the first place. So I think one of the problems, going back to the point that I haven't worked through yet, but my belief that the whole issue is really a demand side issue. Going back to that, the problem is, let's say I'm one of the QAnon conspiracy people, and I'm going to be all over YouTube because there's lots of content on YouTube about
I'll make a quick note on the QAnon thing. I only know about it thanks to Reply All, who did a great episode on it.
It's highly entertaining, but
it's frightening. The sort of religious zealotry that people follow this thing. So it's basically someone. I think he started on 4chan, right? Like the original announcements.
Yeah.
And just sort of made a person who identified themselves as QAnon, so Q Anonymous, started making cryptic posts that sounded predictive, and people basically treating him like some sort of Nostradamus type. Is meant to, they hypothesize that he is actually like CIA insider or something like that, and they know what's going on, and is letting the anonymous trolls of the internet in on the secret, and Trump's the big 4D chess playing genius who's orchestrating the entire thing, working with Mueller to bring down the Pizzagate Democrat child sex ring scandal, and he's faking his connections to Russia as part of the cover, and it's just crazy. Yeah. So that's the QAnon.
I love the QAnon conspiracy because basically it is look at any fact or any dynamic and then just reverse it, turn it around 180 degrees, and there's QAnon there. But we've had people turning up with firearms to a location in America and having a standoff with the police in relation to some information that there had been some kind of child sex trafficking ring and that there was a cover-up of the evidence relating to that. So this weird stuff spills over into the real world. But my point was that, let's say I'm a QAnon junkie and I go to YouTube and I keep finding videos telling me that QAnon is a ridiculous conspiracy hoax. Well, what am I going to do? Am I going to go, oh, I was wrong? No, I'm bought into this. This is part of who I am. I'm one of those special people who is in on the conspiracy. I know what they are trying to hide, and I've got special insight. So YouTube is promoting all of this other content at me. Am I going to be converted by that? Or am I going to start writing posts and making my own videos saying YouTube is part of the deep state? Mm-hmm. That's what's going to happen. I think it's PR. I think it's PR fluff, just like everything that Facebook seems to do. It's an attempt to make it appear that they are taking these issues seriously, when in actual fact these issues are what make them money in the first place.
Yeah, chicken. That's the catch-21, catch-22 sort of situation where. So this is one of the things that has struck me about that problem of they do need to balance the need to look like they're doing something. Because public relations is important to them, to Google and Facebook. They need to look like they're doing something for sure. they also should do something. But part of the problem with this situation, in my opinion, is that it's complex enough that I don't know what they should do. And I don't think anyone really does. And everyone that says, oh, they should do blah, usually hasn't really thought through the consequences, probably nearly as well as Facebook and Google have, because they have to balance the impact of their actions. And they're very aware of the risks, the tightrope that they're walking between inaction and too much action. And at the end of the day, the only thing they've got for them is that they can do PR to try and make everyone like chill out a little bit before everyone just goes, it's your fault, and blames the platforms. When I agree with you that it's a demand side problem more than anything, it's not really the platform's fault so much as human nature, which the platforms have amplified. Because if there's anything technology does really well, it allows us to be us better than we've ever been. So we have these brains. I heard, I think you mentioned it in your last podcast, You Are Not So Smart podcast. One of my favorites podcasts out there. The number of ways that our brain is broken and prone to clinging to confirmation bias and to fall into cognitive bias traps and believe that we're right on very little evidence. It's just it's one of those areas of research and knowledge that I almost wish we would start teaching kindergartners and every year of school a little bit more about how broken our brains are.
That's a really interesting point, because there's also a lot of talk. I was at MisInfo in London. I think it was the back end of last year or earlier this year, and there was a great emphasis there. A fantastic event full of really committed and talented people, but there was a really heavy emphasis on doing something about this, and it was always a kind of it was nearly always a technical solution. It was about fact checking, but there's also a lot of talk, and I've been guilty of it as much as anybody, of digital media literacy, and so we talk a great deal about improving our digital media literacy. However, the more that I have talked about digital media literacy, the more I've noticed that the only people who care about it are the people in my own echo chamber. And what digital media literacy looks like to them is finding ever better ways of debunking whatever anybody who they don't agree with thinks. So we are, as human beings, incredibly self-serving. And so I think that there's a lot of glib talk of solutions to the problem of disinformation. I think there's a great deal of merit in the idea that there may be no solution whatsoever, because there is also there's a lot of very interesting stuff about this. Niall Ferguson, the historian, has written a book, the Bell and the Tower, I think, or the Square and the Tower, where he makes some interesting points about how inevitable the polarization that we're all lamenting and wringing our hands about, how inevitable that is when you bring people together who were never connected previously. And do you remember, Mark Zuckerberg's, wonderful vision of bringing everybody together and the great democratic conversation that would result from that? And what actually seems to have resulted is we've kind of become triggered by what I think some sociologists or other academics call the repugnant social other. And so
I've not heard of that, but I like it.
We're not so worried if we hear about a culture somewhere the other side of the world that does really terrible things. I mean, we don't approve, but it doesn't bother us. But if they move into the village, that becomes an issue, even if they're still not involving us in those things. And it's when the belief sets and the habits and the values of the repugnant social other are in our faces that it becomes an issue. And I think that that's what the internet does,
Very much.
or rather the social web.
Yeah, your video's frozen from my side. Unfortunately, there it goes.
And
catching up.
That's it.
But
did you just lose me then?
Yeah, for a second, unfortunately, you froze, but you're back.
Yeah, I've got a bit of a reconnecting thing going on your end, I think. It's not so much a problem on the web, but on the social web, we cannot avoid these people who kind of repulse us. And I'm extremely aware now that I am repulsive to certain people, and they are repulsive to me.
Yeah.
And therefore, the structure of the social web is just reinforcing the kind of polarization that we've got. And disinformation is part of that dynamic, because everybody uses hyper-partisan information, misinterpreted information, and outright lies to try and hold sway in an argument. So the whole thing is incredibly complex, and certainly far more complex than the old fake news stories we used to hear about the Macedonian teenagers.
Yeah.
I mean, what was never really discussed about that story? They were making so much money because they were producing incredibly popular content.
Yeah.
And another point, when you really open your mind to this issue and stop kind of finger pointing and saying this is just a few bad actors manipulating democracy, there's some really interesting research that shows that the very famous, the most widely shared, I think, fake news story during the 2016 US presidential election was the one about the Pope endorsing Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And I've seen some research that says that most of Trump's base didn't believe that story, but they shared it because there's something else going on. It's a kind of rah, this is us, we're on a roll. Look, even the Pope supports our guy. They don't really believe it.
Yeah.
But it's just fun.
Yeah, actually that reminds me of a great line. I forget who came up with it, but as an observation of Trump's supporters and the people against him, where the people against him would see what Trump would say and think he was being I can't remember the quote. It's like they took Trump at his word literally, whereas his supporters took him at his word emotionally. Do you know the quote I'm talking about? Do you know how it goes?
I'm aware of this.
Whoever said it first said it really well.
Yeah. It's fascinating because, all right, I'm going to talk about my side because I'm a slightly left-leaning, certainly very socially liberal person, and I started the whole journey, which for me began really with Brexit, but certainly continued through Trump and beyond. I began that as snarky and insulting and dismissive of people who don't share my values as anybody. And it's taken a lot of reading and a lot of time to realise that this is more complex than we at first thought, because in Britain, we all thought that the people who voted for Brexit were just thick. And that was the narrative. And that's a horseshit narrative. The fact is, they just think differently than we do. And what you've got then is the problem of if we fact check everything, we're going to persuade people. But we're not, because we don't really care. We just don't care about the facts. And I would argue neither side in this polar divide in the Brexit and Trump shitstorm, neither side really cares what's true. All we care about is that we prevail. Controversial.
Yeah. I'm not sure I agree completely, but part of the framing you're providing there is either side. I think if we're looking at it as a side, like a two-side system, then I can accept that. I can agree with it completely. But like most people, I'm not on a side. I'm on the side of truth. You know, everyone else can pick sides and be left and right. I just care about the truth. You know, and I'm sure I'm the only person that feels that way.
Yeah, this is really interesting, isn't it? Because I want to say that, but I'm really troubled by what is true. I'm really troubled by what we actually mean by what is true. I mean, it's easy to demonstrate outright lies.
Yeah.
But it's extremely difficult to define what is true. And that is a really... I know that one of your subjects was philosophy, and my degree was philosophy.
Yeah.
And it's made this whole era that we're in now has really made me start thinking about what is true. And I'm not suggesting that we cannot sift fact from fiction, because we certainly can.
Yeah.
But when we talk about what is true, I think we can all have a slightly different interpretation in good faith, while not having a monopoly on the truth.
Yeah, for sure. So this is like a pet topic of mine, because I did a double major in my arts degree. So I was philosophy and history and philosophy of science. So I did a lot of studying of Popper and Thomas Kuhn and how it is that science has got to the point where it is, and how science determines truth. And so with the philosophical sort of background in my thinking is that I believe that there is an objective truth, and that's one of my premises. I also believe that as a subjective creature, we have no access to it. All we're ever doing is approximating it. And so the phrase that, if I want to be in common everyday discussions, I'll say that's true, that's not true, and we use the word truth freely because it's practical. It's a pragmatic decision. If we want to be strict, philosophically accurate in our words, the phrase that I've come to love is less wrong. And we are constantly on a mission to become less wrong. We never get to the truth. Science never knows the truth and never can. And so this is where the Popperian falsification comes into it. The idea, for anyone that doesn't know about Thomas Kuhn, Karl Popper, and the principle of falsification, it's that when you have a scientific hypothesis, you craft that hypothesis, which is attempting to become a theory, which is a story that explains the facts. And so you craft that story, and in crafting that story, you identify cases where if the opposite happens, or if this doesn't happen, then the hypothesis, the theory, can't be true. And you identify as many of these points as you can. You say, here's a list of things. Go out and prove this hypothesis wrong. And the entire purpose of science is to disprove theories. That's good science. Because the opposite is, religion is this: you start with a conclusion, then you go and find evidence to back up your conclusion. That is not how science should be done. I'm not saying what science is like, which is where Thomas Kuhn comes into all this, and he says that's not what's done at all. We are actually just paradigm-believing creatures going around trying to prove ourselves true, prove ourselves correct. But in principle, the ideal of science is that we have ideas and we try and prove them wrong. And if you think that process through, what happens is over time, we get better and better at throwing out the errors and the misinformation. We never reach a point where we say this is true. It doesn't matter how many thousands of years we've failed to disprove something. We may just not have the technology yet. We may not have the edge case that disproves it. So we don't know that it's true. But as time progresses and we relentlessly apply this principle to claims and to knowledge, we are hopefully less wrong over time. And so this is the scientific principle, the idea behind science. It's also the same sort of principle behind the Socratic method, which is why the Socratic Web, the project that I'm working on, I called it as such, because I want all claims to have that principle applied to it. Challenge everything. Try and prove it wrong, because that's the best we can ever hope to do, is prove things that are obviously wrong. We can never hope to know that they're true. And so from my studies, and they're not wide, I'm no I'm no professor of philosophy, I'm no expert in the field, it's just a hobby, really. But from my readings, these Socratic method and the principle of falsification are the two best methods we've come up with for sort of approximating the truth, for becoming incrementally less wrong with time. And so when I look at the problem of misinformation, I can't help but reach the same conclusion, that every effort that tries to go to demark true and false is bound to fail. The best option we have is to find a process which allows the average person to apply these principles, the same as we do in science and the same as we do in philosophy, but to apply it in their own everyday practices without expecting them to change their behavior. And that's the hard bit.
Yeah. It is, because we all want there to be a kind of universal paradigm that all things being equal, the distribution of information being equal, the distribution of goodwill and good faith being equal, we will all arrive at the same conclusions about everything. But in reality, it's too complex for that, because we are governed largely by emotion rather than reason, and that is something that the disinformation purveyors have been most successful. The salvation politicians, the people who make money out of fake content as a commercial enterprise, the people who make money out of hyper-partisan content as a commercial exercise, they've been very good at exploiting that.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a little idealistic to hold to the idea that everyone, as long as they have the right information, is going to agree.
Yeah. I had a thought. You broke up a little bit in the video, and it broke my train of thought. That's right. Yeah. It's an interesting phenomenon that it's too complex to expect everyone, given the same facts, to reach the same conclusion. Though to some extent, it's like there's this scale of complexity where somewhere in the scale, we lose a certain percentage of the population, because we could take every single individual on the planet and put them in the house that I'm in and ask them to leave the house, and virtually every single one of them will go through the front or the back door. There's certain aspects of reality that no one questions or doubts and acts accordingly, right? Yeah. So, but as complexity grows, there's more room for different interpretations. And not just complexity, but I think you mentioned a few times the way they think and the way they interpret and so forth. Which is, epistemology, how we think, how we know what we know. And every time you've mentioned it when you were speaking, I kept thinking of, have you seen Danah Boyd's talk at South by Southwest? It was from March, I think.
No.
Do you know Danah Boyd?
Yeah.
She gave a talk, and she's recently written it into an article, or a form of it into an article on Medium, and absolutely brilliant talk. I'll put the link in the notes, and I'll send it to you. One of my favorite talks I've seen on the area, saying very much what you're saying, and identifying two key issues: the social media environment we're in, talk about the repugnant social other. This environment has allowed us to connect with people all around the world that we are not actually connected to in a intimate sort of setting. Whereas the reality of where we've evolved from is this sort of tribal setting. We know people face to face, we form relationships with them, and it changes the dynamic very much when we don't have those relationships. And so Danah was focusing on journalism and how throughout most human recent history, we've had journalists that live in the communities that they're reporting on. And so every individual knows the journalist of the area and they know each other. And so there's a trust that can develop because you know each other. That's gone now. Now journalists are those shady, lying assholes that make up stories to try and sell me products and convince me to vote Democrat when I don't want to or whatever. You know, they're trying to trick us because I don't know who they are and I don't know what their motivations are, etc. So the loss of individual connection to the people that are delivering us information and delivering us knowledge is a huge part of the problem. And this is also what you talked about, but I can't make the segue from what I just said to this bit. But you also talked about teaching media literacy.
Can I just jump in?
Yeah, go for it.
Just jumping in back on that point. Something else that I didn't really appreciate until relatively recently was that this issue of trusting the media and the issue of completely false content is not new.
Yeah.
And I've just recently, because I emigrated to France, I want to try and understand France better than I did as a tourist. I've read a book about the history of France since the revolution, and I was shocked to find out how many actual newspapers there were that were just entirely fake news, generally in the anti-Semitic space.
Today on newsstands,
at the end of the 1800s.
Oh, okay, yeah. Because
so it's not new.
There's this classic, is it the Inquirer? Oh, it's too risky to try and Google it now while we're recording, but there's like classic photos from like the old penny papers in America, like alien contacts and Area 50. Like this conspiratorial sort of stuff's always been there. It's just that on a little book that gets sold on a monthly basis, that you've got to be really interested in it to go seeking it out, as opposed to now, which goes back to what I said earlier about technology really empowering us. Now you just go on Facebook and you can get it delivered to your daily news feed. So that's what's really changed there, right? The accessibility of it.
Yeah, and something I spend a lot of time thinking about fruitlessly is what else has changed that has made the absurd content so popular. Quick anecdote: a long time ago, probably really around the year 2000, I think, a friend introduced me to a website called rense.com, rense.com. And rense.com was
I've seen it.
a fantastic place. And I would spend my lunch breaks in the office over a sandwich and reading all of the weird and wonderful stuff on rense.com. And it was UFOs, and it was Bigfoot, and it was all sorts of paranormal stuff, and it was Nazi flying saucers, and it was. And I read this as entertainment, and interspersed in this stuff was all of the what have become really familiar conspiracy theories, the Illuminati and the New World Order, and all of those things. And I read these as entertainment, and then I'd shut the website down and forget about it. But I read it like a comic. As a child reads a comic, because I found it entertaining and amusing. And yet fast forward sort of 16, 17, 18 years, people are religiously devouring that information and whether or not they believe it's true or not, I think is potentially a moot point.
Yeah, that's a really
It's
good point.
something about it speaks for them
Yeah.
or represents them. So, and I've got no answers. I've got no answers there, but I can't help constantly cycling back to some flaw in our psychology, and something that has gone really badly wrong in the way in which we kind of all feel about the world and our place in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. So you said before that this fake news isn't a new thing. It's always been there, and that's right. After that, you said what changed? What else has changed that has made the absurd become so desired or so
resonant?
Yeah. And my first thought when you said that was that I don't think anything has. I think it's just become visible. And so I say that as when I started working on the Rebuttal project, which has led to the Socratic Web, the community that immediately pounced on it, fell in love with it, and used it, and became our entire user base was the skeptic community. And so this is a community of people who their hobby is to go out and debunk erroneous beliefs and misinformation. Yeah. Whether they're right all the time or not, neither here nor there, that's their objective. Their objective is to be driven by philosophical, scientific principles of evidence and so forth.
I used to subscribe to the Skeptical Inquirer.
Yeah. Nice. And so when you start to sort of engage in that community in that way and see the things that they do and understand sort of that division between the skeptic mind and the non-skeptic mind, and again, I don't mean to sort of say that skeptics are perfect, because it's a community of people, and it doesn't mean everyone that doesn't identify as a skeptic is crazy. Not saying either of those things, but just in an idealistic sense, it was really interesting to see how just about everyone in society believes a lot of really obviously, I don't want to say dumb or stupid, but like wrong things. And it's like, if you put any thought into it, it's like, why? And one of the things that like I had to start sort of reflectively thinking about habits and like sort of beliefs that I didn't think about and hold, but just held. Like walking through a dark area, and it's like my brain's going, something's going to get you. Ghosts, vampires, like all these things come up. And I'm like, hang on, none of those things are real. And like, I know that they're not real.
Yeah.
But the fears and the emotions are there, and it's so hard to ignore those feelings, no matter how much I know they're not true. And so I'm sort of painting that as a picture of like, okay, then if you really get into the skeptic mindset, you start really living life, understanding as best we can reality and probability and statistics. And then you walk down the street and you start seeing all of the people selling psychic readings and people that speak to the dead and homeopathy treatments, and you realize that the absurd is part of our daily life. We really do. The average person readily buys into this stuff. Like, even like celebrity magazines that just make up gossip and, for entertainment value. And again, like I say, do they believe it or not? Most people, like my mum reads entertainment magazines, and even she says, she's like, she doesn't really care. But it's like, it's a story that sort of, I guess you feel connected to, because I know that celebrity, whether you've met them or not. And so you get to learn something, whether it's true or not, doesn't matter.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting case. You mentioned psychic readings, people who speak to the dead, which we know. I mean, for all of my, I hope I haven't come across as being a kind of truth relativist, because I do believe in facts. But is a psychic who is speaking to the deceased member of a bereaved family, are they fake news, or are they providing a kind of psychological service? and it's arguable. It is possible. I happen to think that psychics are charlatans and doubtless do more harm than good. But it is possible to make a case.
Sure. With just about all alt med, just about all alternative medication.
In this, what matters is how the people feel who are hearing this cock and bull story.
There's a balance, because this is one of the problems with alt med is there is value. One of the reasons that people go to alt med practitioners all the time is because doctors are so pressured for time and stuff, that they're so impersonal, and they're so, what's the problem, blah, 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 here's the prescription, and it's robotic. Whereas they go to their alt med practitioner and they get an hour of human interaction, frequently touch is involved because they're touching their lines of meridian and whatever. And like, these are basic human, this is what we are. We're a social species. We don't have claws and fur and strength. We have social complexity and our ability and need to touch and be loved and feel like a human. And that psychology plays into our health. And so there's huge, immense importance in that. And I think that's been shown scientifically time and time again. The problem with the misinformation side of it is you believe you're going in to have your energy aligned, but in fact you're just seeing a therapist of sorts, or you're just engaging in human contact. Those beliefs have ways of playing themselves out to your detriment. Whereas if we just knew what we were doing and understood it, we would do more of the right thing rather than... I now don't need to pay $1,000 for him to use the high energy alignment.
Yeah. Just given a fantastic analogy for Trump. So Trump is the psychic. He's providing the comfort.
Yeah.
He is making a certain part of his base feel special and feel heard. It's going to hurt them eventually, but that's a really interesting analogy, and there is a massive of disinformation in both cases. I've got one other thought. I think we've fallen down. I'm sorry if I have caused this to happen. I think we've kind of fallen down a bit of a philosophical rabbit hole here.
In the conversation.
I'm just going to helicopter back up and share another thought, which goes back to the whole attention economy issue. And it is, did you notice that Twitter posted its first ever quarter profit this year? It was a very underreported story, but Twitter's user base, I think, had been fairly stagnant for a long time, and it hadn't been making any money. And then this year it posted its first ever quarter profit figures, and the user base has been growing. And I haven't done any research, I haven't read any research on why, but I suspect it's probably because of the incredibly controversial things that are going on politically, whether it's with Brexit, Trump, or in India, Mexico. And I think that engagement of people on the social web with what's going on in the wider world is actually pulling more and more people into these kind of arguments. And I think the currency online is outrage. Ultimately, I think and I count myself in this cohort, we just love to be really angry about...
It's hard not to reply when the other person is so wrong.
Yes, exactly. And so I've been trying, and I say trying, and I haven't succeeded all the time. I've been trying to wind my own neck in and be less snarky online, because I began to recognize that actually this was just entertainment, and I was getting some kind of little, every time I delivered a snarky rebuttal and a put down, I was getting that little oxytocin hit. Is it oxytocin?
Oxytocin's the hugging love drug.
No,
Dopamine is
you
the
do get
reward
that,
drug.
don't you?
Sorry?
Don't you feel good when you've just really snarked somebody? Anyway, whatever the name of the chemical
Maybe
involved,
dopamine, yeah.
I was getting it. I was getting a hit of it. And that's incredibly addictive.
Yeah.
And yet one's social web experience is really diminished when we don't engage with that. And so I think we've got a lot more people joining in the ruck, and it's entertainment more than any kind of debate or conversation. So structurally, I think it's going to get more and more. It's going to get more and more wild out there.
Yeah, it's actually, I find it hard to predict what's going to happen because when was it? When are we? Earlier this year, I found myself, well, really since November, I've been like this wave pattern of getting sucked into arguments and getting really emotional and frustrated and spending way too much time on Facebook, is where I probably spend more of my time. And finding myself feeling depressed at the process and frustrated at the world and beaten down until I reach a point where it's like a breaking point. I'm like, I don't know why I'm doing this. I'm not getting anything out of it. I hate it and I hate myself for doing it. And so I have a couple of times now, and this is what I mean, it's a sine wave. I reach a point like, I don't want to look at Facebook anymore. And I do. I don't, you see people do all the time, rage quit Facebook. I haven't done that. I just literally stopped looking at it because it annoys me. So it's interesting. It's like they need to walk a tight line of, they want a little bit of this to bring people in, but not so much that people end up resenting them for making them feel bad about themselves and about the world.
Yeah.
It's tricky. One of the things, the second thing that Danah Boyd said in her article, to take us back a little bit, that's relevant here, was about, rather than start there, so you just said something about this is entertainment. And that's what reminded me of the second thing, which is Danah Boyd talking about media literacy. And the problem of this group of people that are the 4chan anons, the anonymous people, the trolls, who approach disinformation and these online discussions specifically as entertainment. They are very knowingly wading into these complex, emotional, charged environments to get a rise and laugh at it. And
did Danah Boyd write? Was she one of the authors of The Ambivalent Internet? That's a very good book that I read on exactly this phenomenon.
Yeah, no, I don't know anything that she's
recommend it to everyone.
Okay. What is it? The Ambivalent?
The Ambivalent Internet.
Okay, cool. And so one of the concerns that she expressed in her talk about media literacy and critical thinking as a solution is the way that these groups and these people that are just looking for a way out can use it to just end up being very effective at challenging the authoritative sources and challenging claims and evidence and information that is based in reality, and get very good at doing it for the purposes of trolling, for getting a rise, and for sort of asserting control of their information space because they've got control of nothing else. And so it's a real problem when, and this is something that I've read once. I don't have any particular knowledge about this, but I've read once about Nazis in World War II using this as part of the propaganda machine. It was a comment by a journalist at the time that the Nazis, don't care about truth. Arguments and words is the weapon for them, and they'll say anything to create the debate, whereas we that care are constantly fighting these claims of untruth, and we will never win because they aren't listening to the facts and the evidence. They're just arguing for the sake of arguing. And I feel, and I don't remember the quote, obviously, because I didn't quote it, but I remember that concept so strongly because that's exactly what we're doing now. There's this complete imbalance between these people that are real and trolls. Actually, that's something I did want to ask you. We're running into the last 5 minutes now. I'll keep it to an hour. But these trolls that may be manufactured, but that manufactured trolling shadow internet that is disinformation campaigns only works because there is an army of real people that are doing this because they really want to fight and argue for entertainment value, and they don't care at all about evidence or truth or reality, and I don't think they even care about the outcomes. It's not like they're actually doing it to support Trump or whatever, other than because supporting Trump gets a rise out of you. And that's
exactly, and that is no longer confined to warring camps across the political divides or across the scientific divide, in the case of climate change. It is anybody who disagrees with anybody else is starting to behave more and more troll-like.
Yeah.
And that's a real issue. But it comes back to what I said earlier. I think it's entertainment. I think for the most part, this stuff is entertainment. We actually should all be just spending a lot less time on the social web, but I can't tear myself away from it.
Too much dopamine availability.
Yeah, exactly. Dopamine was the word I was looking for.
Yeah, I said it.
Not oxytocin.
Yeah. The question that I wanted to ask was, what in all of you're looking into these Twitter bots and the shadow characters, do you have any hypothesis as to who the main actor is behind it? Or
no.
What's your
No, I don't. I know that there's a wealth of evidence that Putin is responsible for a lot of it, and I've got no reason to think he isn't. But from all of the research that I've done, I think there's just as much of this coming just from commercial sources. So there was a fascinating, and it's not often being commented on, but there was a fascinating piece of research done. I'll have to message you separately because I can't remember who did it, where some academics identified one social media company in Dubai, I think, which had deployed bots for both Vote Leave and Britain Stronger in Europe, or maybe not for those official campaigns.
I get it. I understand why they did that. That's clever.
Arguing for Brexit and for Remain. I think there's a massive business model. There's a lot of money in promoting stuff.
But you know what's brilliant
John
about that?
Have talked about it. We find cryptocurrency, fintech, all of the whole sort of influencer space where people are trying to develop a name for themselves, absolutely rife throughout that. The whole gaming of somebody's apparent reputation for expertise and leadership qualities.
Yeah.
It's a massive business model. If you talk to people at the Atlantic Council, they do really interesting work, which reveals that a lot of sort of false content is and hyper partisan content is only designed to shift product. And we look at InfoWars. What is InfoWars? InfoWars is just shifting product, isn't it? Brain pills. That's all it is.
Stephen Colbert did a great skit mocking that.
Yeah.
Calling out the sales of the product. Yeah.
Yeah.
It is a brilliant move for a PR marketing firm to put out bots that appeals to certain demographics and then just churn along in the crowd to gain followers, right? They're saying the things that they know certain groups of people want to hear, so they'll get followers, so those bots that will be simple to create and simple to automate will get more influence that they can then use for their customers. Say, look, we've got an army of 100 bots that have got 1 million followers, 100 million followers between them, whatever, and just give us what you want to sell and we'll market it. So it's scary to think of how many people playing in this space are doing it with no interest in the content that they're perpetuating and no concern for the consequence of it, purely to piggyback on the virality of the action for marketing purposes.
You asked me where I think the lion's share of it comes from. I still think that the lion's share of it comes from ordinary people, because if you think about it, you can construct a persona from scratch and end up with quite a following if you're good at it online. And I think that must be quite a satisfying thing to do. There's the classic. Here's the classic example of nobody ever really being able to agree on where the problem comes from. Take the Twitter account. I'm going to give you an exclusive now. The Twitter account DavyJoe52951945. So that
we frozen.
No longer a particularly egregious UKIP supporting Twitter account. And last year, somebody did a thread where they said, "Oh, look, this is being amplified by lots of Russian bots and it's tweeting during Moscow office hours." I think I know who that person is. It's not a Russian.
Yeah.
I know quite a lot about that person. I haven't doxed them because they haven't really they haven't broken any laws. But it's interesting that people kind of just want that to be the Russians. And my message to people often is Occam's razor. It's quite likely just to be, the person up the road.
There's another term. Have you heard of
this? Because they feel strongly about it, but they daren't do it in the open.
Have you heard of Hanlon's razor?
No.
Don't attribute to malice what can be explained with stupidity or incompetence.
Yeah. I like it.
Yeah. I think I've got it right. Yeah.
So I think I think the argument or the debate has moved on really from fact checking to I think a lot more. It's for me now. It's more about how we all behave. And I'm sorry I haven't got any answers, but that's where I'm heading with this.
That's perfect, because unfortunately that's the ultimate thing. Is like, how do you change human behavior on a global scale?
Yeah.
And on that front, we'll keep, as long as you're happy to stay for a little bit longer, because this is really interesting to me. What you just sort of stumbled into is I want to point out. Like, I agree, I don't think fact-checking is the solution at all, and I never really have, but utterly crucial. Like, it's part of that background, like science, utterly crucial. The fact that half of the population doesn't agree with climate scientists doesn't mean that climate scientists aren't utterly necessary to inform the situation, right? So fact-checkers, journalism, etc., crucial to the background that we need to have in place to make any solution work. And similarly with media literacy, like teaching kids how to be critical thinkers and how to read media, crucial. But my position on both of those things, and so many of the other things that are being attempted, is that they are being done. It's the status quo. And it's unlikely that anything that we do now, which is the same version, just slightly different to that, is going to magically fix everything. Like, I think any solution we have has to be substantially different or significant in some way, which brings us to what needs to change is sort of human behavior, human culture, our brains. My background's in molecular biology, so maybe it's a genetic engineering problem. But what I find interesting is taking that as I agree with that. That's my position. So let's take that as true for the moment, that we need to change human behavior. And we need to do it, when you think about it, the solution has to be global. It's not like we can change American culture and the world's fixed, or we can change Russian culture, or my local community. This is a global issue because there's no borders anymore on the internet. And so this is why every time I hear people say everyone's focusing on a technological solution, but technology is not the problem, we are, or I can't help but think, but technology is the crux of the problem now, for the reasons I said earlier. It's the amplification of ourselves. And at the same time, the only thing that we have to facilitate a global change of culture and behavior is the technology that we all interface with. And we already know that technology changes behavior because we have social media, because we have phones, because we are being conditioned and trained to behave certain ways, to respond to notifications, to believe what we see. One of the examples I've sort of come up with is, to some extent, I don't know if there's research on this, and I don't know how the research would pan out, but my hypothesis is that to some extent, me and everyone younger than me at least is outsourcing their memory to some extent, because we can just Google anything.
Yeah.
And so when we have a certain amount of knowledge about the technology around us, it does change how we think and how we act and our culture because of it. And so this is why I believe that a solution to this problem is technology which works on that. Technology which is intentionally designed to affect human behavior and human culture and affect it towards better critical thinking, media literacy, skepticism. Having said that, that's not the solution. Even if we change human culture that way, that doesn't necessarily solve it. But
yeah,
what's the other big one? Is like being kind to each other, amicability, and there's a word that's regularly used in that space. But to design technology which changes everyone that uses the technology to be better at those things, I think is the foundations to the solution. I don't know the details, but it's a concept.
Yeah, I've got. I think if there's one thing that I feel is a really clear part of the solution, for me, it's transparency. So what I was really interested in was who's the guy? His Twitter handle is Gavin's blog. Gavin. Oh, it's so frustrating because he's a
full background.
He's a data guy. I'll ping you his details. During the repeal the eighth or keep the during the recent Irish referendum, he did some digging on advertising that was being done on Facebook in favour of keeping the Eighth Amendment.
Gavin Sheridan?
Therefore, that's it. Gavin Sheridan.
The whole time.
I hope he doesn't hear this, because I'm a massive fan of his. And he did some really nice digging to expose who was behind the adverts on Facebook that were pushing to keep the Eighth Amendment and to maintain the ban on abortion in Ireland. And it changed everything. It changed the way that people saw those adverts. And there have been adverts running recently on Facebook from a website called mainstreamnetwork.co.uk, which is just a WordPress site with no contact details, no attribution. But they have been advertising on Facebook and in Facebook Messenger, pushing geo-targeted advertising before a recent parliamentary vote a few weeks ago, saying, tell your MP to respect the will of the people. And nobody knows who that is. And Facebook have introduced, haven't they, an experiment in advertising transparency in Ireland and Canada, I think. And it doesn't go far enough because it doesn't show an archive of adverts yet. But I think that understanding where stuff comes from in terms of the motivation for it is part of the solution. So someone was sending me a message urging me to vote a certain way or make a decision about something. I'd quite like to know who they are. So it's fine.
And we have that in in law, don't we? With political advertising, we always have that sign off. That's how important it is. We've enshrined it in law in certain circumstances. And they're getting around it.
That doesn't apply online. It is still the Wild West. It could be anybody pretending to be independent. I mean, all of these actors pretend to be independent. Gavin Sheridan sort of dissected the messages from the adverts and the websites of these actors in the Irish referendum. Turned out to be the religious right in America, positioning themselves as independent when they clearly weren't. So I think that transparency and that is a workable, that is something that can be regulated for. It's a little bit like GDPR. We now have much more control over the data that we give away, whereas we didn't before. And I think that transparency about the sources of information, I think, is part of the solution. It's not the total solution, but it's certainly part of the solution. It won't change anything for certain people who are really, really bought into a certain set of ideas. But there's a whole load of people, I think, in the middle, probably the majority, who would quite like to know that and might make their mind up according to who they understood was trying to influence them.
Yeah, I agree. Transparency is definitely one of those solutions which at least doesn't have the other problems of... I've written an article recently on the problems of adjudicating truth and falsity and how you offside people that disagree with you. Instead of changing their mind, you just make them hate your system, right? And so transparency is one of those things that doesn't have that problem. So even though the majority of people have false beliefs, that doesn't mean, if you implement transparency, you're not offsiding 90% of the population now. You're just being transparent. It's one of those, implementations that doesn't have any obvious negative side effects. I can think of some in certain circumstances, but as you say, it's the sort of thing you could legislate for, and I think if legislated for, you'd have to make specific exemptions for those certain circumstances, and that's doable as well.
Oh, there's a whole load of detail. It would be quite complex
but very
make
feasible all the same.
To make it sufficiently comprehensive. But it also plays to another issue that troubles me, which is the role of think tanks. And so we have think tanks which are astroturfing. They're just astroturfing the media by pretending to be think tanks, when in actual fact they're just hyper-partisan lobbying operations and PR operations. And we don't know. We just don't know. The Taxpayers Alliance is one of my favourites or unfavourites. We just don't know. And transparency there would be most welcome, because if you are going to position yourself as trying to influence policy and trying to nudge people into behaving one way rather than another, I would quite like to know what your agenda is and what the agenda of your backers is. So transparency is, I think, possibly my biggest beacon in terms of any kind of set of solutions generally in the world of the information that we consume.
Brilliant. Well, we'll leave it there, because I can do this all day, and I get the impression that we could do this together all day.
We could.
I hope that we'll probably do another episode in the near future. Have you on again after I have a few other people on and see if much has changed in the time. But until then,
yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing what everybody else has to say. I think it's a really nice idea that you've got. So good luck with it.
Thank you. I was going to say, where can they find your podcast and follow you on Twitter and all that?
Oh, they'll find me on Twitter at MikeH_PR. They'll find the podcast in all of the usual places. Links to iTunes and an RSS feed and a SoundCloud page can be found at MikeHind, MikeHind.co.uk.
Great, and I'll provide links anyway. Any final words? Anything else?
I think my final thought on this is that this is a burgeoning area of discussion, and that can only be a good thing. 3 years ago, I'd never had this conversation with anybody, and now it's a daily occurrence, at least online. So I would urge everybody not to be too disheartened. We're in the early stages of realising how big the problem is, but that's a better place to be than we were in early 2016 in the UK.
We now have an unknown unknown rather than an unknown unknown.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much, Mike.
And good luck with the podcast.
Thank you.
All the best, Shane.
See ya.